They never stopped singing. We only stopped listening. That's the line they found in the priest's ledger, ink dried like blood, pressed so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. But that isn't the part no one could explain. No. What they couldn't explain was this. That ledger was written 3 days after the 9 children were already sealed inside the walls. This isn't folklore. This isn't a campfire ghost story. This is Bellhurst, 1872. A chapel so forgotten it wasn't on the township maps. A building without a road. No congregation, just 9 children, and the hymns no one remembers teaching them. And a priest who whispered sermons to the empty pews, as if someone else was listening. You were never meant to know this. The town buried the story under snow and silence. They say a bell rang once, just once, after the children vanished. No wind, no hand, just a final unholy note echoing across the fields like a summons. And what they found, sewn into linen, wrapped in hymns, hidden inside the chapel walls, changed them. You feel it already, don't you? That tightening in your chest, that uneasy pull behind the eyes. That's not fear. That's the veil thinning. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a mystery. It's a ritual. And once you begin, you don't walk away untouched. You're here now. That means something inside you already knew. Something's been calling. A low hum behind the noise of your daily life. A strange melody only the lost ever hear. So lean closer. Because after this, after what I'm about to show you, nothing you believe about the innocence of childhood, the purity of faith, or the safety of walls will survive. The Bellhurst choir murders weren't just tragic. They were deliberate. And what was buried inside those timbers wasn't just children. It was a message. One they sang without mouths. Autumn came early to Bellhurst in 1872. Not with gold leaves or harvest winds, but with a silence so deep, even the crows stopped crying. The chapel sat at the far edge of Hawthorne County, beyond the orchards, beyond the farms, where the land turned marshy and the ground never quite dried. No carriage went there. No road dared to reach it. Just a thin footpath, worn by the same 9 pairs of shoes, week after week. The children. They walked in single file, every Sabbath before sunset, robes tucked under wool coats, hymn books clutched tight. No parents accompanied them. No other townsfolk ever followed. Why would they? The Bellhurst Chapel had long ceased being a place of worship. It became something else, a monument to neglect, a shell for sound, a container for faith so old it forgot its own name. And then there was Father Ellery. A man of parchment-thin skin and a voice that barely crept beyond the pulpit. He kept no flock, just led the choir, 9 children aged 7 to 13, boys and girls with serious eyes and voices older than their bones. Locals said the hymns didn't sound quite right, too slow, too precise, as though rehearsed for someone far more exacting than any living parishioner. And yet the chapel never missed its song, not once, even in frost, even in storm. Even when a fever swept through the town and left 5 mothers bedridden, the children walked that path, unblinking, unbothered, unspeaking. You think it's just eerie, a bit of old-time superstition. But what if I told you the hymns they sang weren't from any hymnal? That the notes scrawled in Ellery's ledgers matched no known scale? That the rhythms echoed not through music halls, but tunnels? Yes, tunnels. Later the sheriff would say the chapel sounded hollow when he knocked against its floor, and the children's voices. A carpenter swore the beams themselves had been humming, vibe, rating low, like a cello's final breath. That's why you're here, isn't it? To know what no one else will speak aloud. to feel that chill crawl up your spine when you realize this isn't a tale of murder. It's a ritual misremembered as tragedy. And the children? They didn't sing for salvation. They were singing to stay remembered. It started with a scent. Not blood, not rot, but milk, sweet, spoiled, and warm. The kind of warmth that doesn't belong to anything living. Father Ellery arrived early that morning, earlier than usual. The path to the chapel was glassy with frost, brittle beneath his boots. But inside, the air was thick, dense, breathing. The chapel hadn't been opened yet, and yet the candle stubs below the choir robes burned to the wick. And the robes? Still hanging in perfect order, all 9, sleeves limp but unmoved, as if the children had stepped out of them mid-song. He called out their names. No answer. Only the rafters above whispering dust. Only silence, where sound should have echoed. In his ledger, he wrote 2 words in shaking hand. Choir absent. But that was a lie, because absence leaves behind nothing. What he found left behind was presence, without form, and the smell, that spoiled milk. It clung to the cedar panels. It soaked the hymn books. It pulsed in the stillness, like breath exhaled from under the floorboards. By midday, panic had begun to ripple across Bellhurst. 9 children missing. No prints in the frost. No witnesses. Just a stable boy who claimed, eyes wide, voice cracking, that he'd heard something strange before dawn. A song drifting across the fields, slow, dissonant, full of gaps between the notes, as though something was missing, or had been taken. He said it made his teeth ache. No one believed him. But then again, no one dared go to the chapel alone either. That night, mothers gathered at the chapel path, clutching scarves and ribbons, muttering names like mantras, but their voices did not reach the building. Because by then, something else had taken hold, something that does not answer when called, something that keeps children not as hostages but as choirs, choirs of the forgotten, of the willing, of those who sang the old so, is not written in ink but in lineage. You're starting to see it, aren't you? This wasn't a disappearance. This was a transfer, a passing of flesh into memory, of names into notes, and of children into instruments. The bell rang once, no wind, no hand, no cause, just a sound, deep, metallic, final. The kind of sound that closes a chapter of the world, not just a book. It was Father Ellery who heard it first, though he never touched the rope. And when the townsfolk arrived, drawn like moths to a flame they could not name, they found the bell's rope severed, not cut, frayed, as if pulled apart by something older than metal and colder than any winter. The fibers were burned black from the inside. That's when the sheriff rode in. Not a man of superstition, not easily shaken. But even he paused outside the chapel door, lantern held high, listening, not for the choir, but for what came after. He found Ellery kneeling at the altar, clutching robes that no longer hung but lay folded in his arms like bodies. The priest didn't speak, didn't look up, just lifted a strip of linen stiff with frost and something else. Sewn into its hem were 9 initials, and in each stitch, a puncture. The sheriff ran his thumb across the thread and felt it bite, as if it still remembered the hand that fed the needle. No one remembered the robes ever being marked. No one remembered who made them. But there they were, names etched not in ink, but in pain. That night, the search began. Men with torches and shovels, not to find footprints. They already knew there'd be none. But to find something beneath the chapel. Because the ground was warm, too warm. Even as frost webbed the windows like veins, the earth pulsed with heat, like a heartbeat waiting to be answered. And it wasn't just warmth, it was sound, low, constant, like breath echoing through a long corridor. One man dropped his lantern and ran when he pressed his ear to the floorboards and heard what he swore were fingernails on wood, but not in panic, in rhythm. Now listen closely, because if the story stopped here, it would be horrified. Oh, but this is where it begins. You are not just hearing of a chapel that buried its children. You are hearing of a place that transformed them. They weren't victims. They were vessels. Say the phrase, "They are only beneath," twice in the comments to show you're hearing them too, and to lock in your own descent into forbidden knowledge. They tore up the floorboards by lantern light. Not to find graves. Graves would have been mercy. They were looking for something else, something the priest would not name, and the sheriff dared not imagine. What they uncovered beneath the chancel was not soil, it was heat. The earth breathed, slow and damp, like flesh just under fever. One man placed his hand flat against it and recoiled, swearing it throbbed beneath his palm like something alive. Still, they dug. They found nothing. No bodies, no tunnels, just that warm, pulsing dirt, like the chapel itself had swallowed the children whole. And then, the sound. Faint, barely there. A hush of soft shuffling, like bare feet pacing, unseen behind the walls, as if the choir was still inside, but with no desire to come out. They posted guards that night. The sheriff placed 2 men at the chapel threshold with rifles and strict orders. But when dawn broke, the door hung open. The guards were gone. Only a glove remained, soaked through with frost. And something else. Something darker than blood, yet sticky as sin. Inside the air shimmered, not from fire, from pressure. Like breath trapped in lungs that should not exist. And there, in the nave, the robes. Laid out in perfect symmetry along the aisle, each one folded with ritualistic care, each topped by an open hymn book, each page stuck to the next, soaked. No one wanted to turn them, but the sheriff did. And between the pages, he found a scrap of parchment, handwritten, uneven, the ink still wet, though no pen had touched it in days. It read, "We are only waiting to be named." That's when they realized. Names hold power, especially the ones erased, especially when carved into flesh, sewn into linen, whispered through hymns no living soul remembers teaching. And the choir, they were not missing, they were becoming. This is the moment where most men look away. But you're not most men. You're still here. So understand this. What was buried under Bellhurst was not a tragedy. It was a summoning. Ruth Penrose hadn't slept in 2 days. Her grandson, Isaac, had been the youngest in the choir, barely 8, voice like cut crystal. She used to say when he sang, it felt like the house itself held its breath to listen. That night, she saw it. A lantern, flickering behind the chapel's warped glass where no flame had burned in days. She rose from bed without thought, slipped on her slippers, crossed the frozen yard barefoot. Something deeper than grief was guiding her, something ancestral, a call that bypasses logic and strikes the bone. The chapel door was ajar. The guards were gone. No footprints. just a hush so heavy it felt like stepping into the lungs of something immense. And waiting. Inside, silence. But her eyes adjusted. 9 robes. No longer hanging, no longer innocent. Laid side by side in a perfect row, aligned like bodies in a morgue, each topped with an open hymn book, pages trembling, though there was no wind. And then she heard it. Breathing. Not hers, not imagined. 9 soft exhalations, steady, in unison, like sleepers, like a lullaby made of breath. She turned and fled, the cold forgotten. Behind her, the chapel bell rang once, sharp, sudden, final, but no one had touched it. By morning, the entire township had gathered, drawn not by logic, but by gravity, the kind of emotional mass only terror can create. Inside, they found them. 9 recessed hollows carved into the far wall, just wide enough for a child's shoulders. Inside each, linen-wrapped shapes, faces turned inward, mouths sewn shut, with coarse black thread. The priest trembled as he touched the seams, but swore he felt a vibration, like a voice that wanted to scream, but could only sing. This was no grave. This was a design. No blood, no struggle, just the quiet aftermath of something that had rehearsed this moment for centuries. You understand now, Dons? Did you? This wasn't possession. It was permission. 9 children, 9 vessels, 9 notes in a chord that still echoes beneath the timbers. The township should have held funerals. Instead, it held its breath. There were no coffins, no procession, no hymns sung in farewell. Only lines of pale-faced parents trailing past the chapel, pressing their hands to the frost-blackened door. Listening, hoping to hear something, anything. But the silence that pressed through those timbers was not absence. It was containment. Father Ellery stopped speaking entirely. He refused company, refused food, sat alone in the nave, his ledger open before him, writing. Recording what? Not scripture, not ceremony. He wrote what no one wanted to know. He wrote that the linen felt damp each morning, that the mouths beneath the stitches had curled into faint, impossible smiles as the sun crept through the cracked panes. He described the hymn they last practiced, not one from any known collection. No. This was older. Pre-paper, pre-ink, pre-language. A song passed down in shadows, in the hum of wind through bone, in lullabies whispered by mothers who never knew where the melody came from. And beneath all that, beneath the entries, the scratches of the pen, the weakening hand, he wrote a single note. They never stopped singing. We only stopped listening. 3 days after those words appeared in the ledger, something changed. They went to seal the chapel for good, brought hammers, nails, wood thick enough to withstand time. But when they pried open the walls again, the linen was gone. No shapes, no children, just air. And that warmth, that ever-persistent, unnatural warmth, as if the chapel itself had exhaled during the night. Father Ellery vanished that same day. No tracks, no struggle, just his ledger left open on the altar, its last page curled in a draft no one could feel. And in the margin, one final word, pressed deep enough to scar the wood beneath the paper. Beneath. That's where the sheriff knelt, ear to the floor, listening not for life, but for continuation. Because when you truly understand what happened at Bellhurst, you realize the children were not taken. They were transformed into something eternal, something that remembers. Say the phrase, "They are only beneath," again, in the comments to confirm you still walk this path. They found the shaft by accident. It was hidden beneath the nave just past the altar, under a layer of warped floorboards that seemed newer than the rest, as if the chapel had repaired itself after the ritual was complete. When they pried it open, a wave of heat struck them. Dense, wet, unnatural. The kind of warmth found in the breath of a dying animal, or something trying to be born. The sheriff descended alone. Lantern raised, jaw locked, his boots thudding softly on the rungs of a narrow ladder carved into the wall. The others watched the light dim until it was no more than a faint amber ember, swallowed by the dark. What he found below would never leave him. A chamber, just tall enough to crouch. Walls scored with thin, deliberate scratches, not random, not frantic, measured, intentional, repetitive, finger marks, small ones, in rows, like notation. As if the children had written a song into the dirt itself. Along the far side lay 9 shallow hollows in the floor, perfectly shaped for small bodies, though now empty. Only impressions remained, pressed deep into the packed soil, the way you'd find where a bowl once sat on a dusty shelf. The sheriff placed his hand into the nearest hollow and felt it. Not temperature, not texture, but vibration. A hum. Faint, but constant, like the last sustained note of a song no longer being sung. When he climbed out, his face was pale. His eyes didn't meet the others. His hands trembled, and he wiped them over and over on his coat, as if trying to remove something he couldn't explain. Behind him, the light from his lantern flickered. The chapel groaned. And on the pew at the front, where nothing had sat for days, was now a neatly stacked pile of hymn books, their pages closed. As if the children had just finished rehearsal. One man reached for the top volume. But the sheriff's voice cut the silence in half. "Don't!" The man froze. "They belong to them now." And that's when it became real. This was not grief. This was not loss. This was ownership. The chapel did not house ghosts. It housed rights. Snow fell again that night. Not gentle, not soft, but in sheets, thick, blinding, and final. By morning the chapel had vanished beneath it, as if the earth itself had grown ashamed and tried to bury the thing it could no longer control. But 2 days later, the snow melted just enough to reveal what had changed. The bell. It had fallen from the tower, snapped clean from its moorings, and plunged into the frozen ground with such force that the earth split open beneath it. The bell itself, unmoved, uncracked, just resting, heavy as judgment. And in the soft dirt beneath where it lay, they saw them. 9 small footprints, each one facing forward, toward the chapel door, pressed into the frost-laced ground with the weight of return, not escape. Not a single print turned back. No explanation made sense. The snow had been untouched, the bell had not rolled, and the chapel somehow had not been disturbed, only marked, like a tombstone pressed into the very bones of the land. That afternoon the sheriff ordered the chapel boarded shut, not for protection, for containment. He nailed the boards himself, every strike of the hammer echoing like a toll from the bell that no longer hung. And when he finished, he didn't walk away. He leaned in, pressed his ear against the door, closed his eyes, and listened. He told no one what he heard, only that it wasn't silence, that it was warm, rhythmic, close, breathing. He said it felt like standing inches away from the other side of a heartbeat. That evening, The mothers of the missing gathered. 9 women, 9 keepsakes, a woolen cap, a ribbon, a scrap of parchment with initials stitched in shaking hands. They didn't cry anymore. They prepared. Because now they knew something few ever come to realize. The dead are not always gone. Sometimes they are simply beneath, not buried, not lost, just rehearsing, waiting for their next cue, waiting to be heard again. They called them the returned, not ghosts, not spirits, just the quiet ones. No one spoke of them directly, not after what Ruth Penrose saw the night she left her sewing room candle burning too long. It was past midnight when she saw them. 9 small figures, barely shadows, walking single file toward the chapel through waist-high snow. Their heads bowed, their arms at their sides, feet bare. They moved with intention, not like wanderers, but like pilgrims. Each one pressed their hand to the fallen bell. And that's when the snow melted beneath their feet. Not steam, not magic. Heat. A deep, radiating warmth rising from the metal as if it had recognized them, its true masters. Then they disappeared. Not around the building, through it, right through the boarded door, without disturbing a single plank. By dawn, the sheriff returned with men and crowbars. He was done waiting. They pulled at the boards, but none resisted. Nails slid free like they had never been hammered in, as if the building wanted to be opened again. Inside, stillness, but the kind that knows you're there. And on the floor, where before there had been only absence, lay 9 bundles. Small, wrapped in linen, arranged in a perfect circle around the bell, which now sat in the center of the nave, though no trail marked its passage inside. Each bundle contained only 3 things. A child's choir robe, perfectly folded. A hymn book open to a page with no ink, just indentations, as though the notes had been pressed into the paper by a hand made of breath. And finally, a sprig of winter myrtle bound in black thread. The sheriff did not touch them. He didn't speak. Only nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he'd always feared. "They've come home," he whispered. But no one repeated the words. Because home is not always sanctuary. Sometimes it is the vessel, and these children had not returned to be mourned. They had returned to complete the song. By week's end, Bellhurst stopped using the word missing. It didn't feel right anymore. The town had shifted, like a spine bent under the weight of something no one wanted to admit. People stopped asking questions, not out of fear of answers, but fear of what questions invite. They called them the quiet ones. Not to soften the truth, but because no one could say what they had become. The sheriff made one final order. No one was to touch the bundles. No one was to claim them. No funeral. No burial. The chapel would remain locked, but unbarred, in case they needed to come and go. It was then Father Ellery returned. No explanation, no carriage, no witness. Just seated again at the altar one morning, his hair gone snow-white, eyes ringed in violet, as if he'd seen something in the dark that refused to leave. He spoke only to the sheriff, in hushed, fragmented phrases. No one else. But neighbors reported strange things. Each night, a thin singing rose from the chapel. It wasn't like the old hymns. Those were structured, harmonious, safe. This was something else. It started brittle, uneven. Then it built, layer upon layer, until the notes wove into something you could feel more than hear, something older than language. Some claimed it matched the final hymn the children had practiced. But when asked, none could recall the lyrics. Not even the tune. Only the feeling it left behind, something warm and wrong at the same time. And in the small hours of the night, strange reports began to trickle in. Knocks at windows, shadows passing behind curtains. Mothers waking to find choir robes draped over the ends of beds. Robes they had locked away, folded, hidden. One woman found a hymn book on her kitchen table, open to a blank page that shimmered faintly in the dark, as if coated in breath. She touched it. It was warm. She never spoke again, the town bee.
Eager to understand, this wasn't over. It was seasonal, cyclical. They weren't mourning anymore. They were preparing. Because songs this old don't die. They hibernate. And Bellhurst had been quiet for far too long. It happened again in early spring. Lydia Crane awoke before dawn, throat dry, heart pounding without reason. The fire had gone out, but the room was warm. Too warm. At the foot of her bed, her son's choir robe, folded, clean, still marked with the initials she had stitched in mourning. She had locked it away weeks earlier, sealed inside the cedar chest. The chest now stood open, its hinges unbroken. Her breath caught, not from fear, but recognition. A folded scrap of paper slipped from the robe's sleeve and drifted to the floor. She picked it up with shaking hands. It had been torn from the chapel ledger. The ink was blotted, the writing trembled, but the message was clear. "They are not gone," it read. "They are only beneath." Her husband, skeptical, always, snatched it from her hands and threw it into the fire. But the paper didn't burn. It curled. It blackened. But the words simply faded, vanishing into the heat without ever catching flame. That night she placed the robe back in the cedar chest, but this time she wedged a chair beneath the door latch, not because she feared her son's return, but because she could no longer be sure what might return with him. The chapel grew restless. Passers-by claimed they heard the bell toll softly at dusk, though it lay cracked and unmoving across the nave floor. Each morning, fresh footprints appeared in the snow. 9. Small. Bare. Leading from the chapel threshold to the road. Never away from it. Never toward the fields. Only to us. Only toward the living. Father Ellery resumed his vigils in the nave. Each night he knelt before the 9 linen bundles. He lit a single candle, spoke in hushed tones to the dark. When asked what he whispered, he only said, "The lullaby must be tended." The sheriff came one night just to check. He found the priest kneeling in silence, not speaking, just listening. Gee. And though the air was warm, his breath fogged with each exhale, as though the space around the bundles was colder than death. Outside, the frost thickened again. Inside, the hymn continued. Not in words, not in sound, but in presence. They hadn't come back to haunt. They had come back to finish what they started. The thaw didn't bring peace. It brought clarity. With snow receding, the chapel's yard should have softened, should have bloomed. Instead, the grass died in perfect circles around the building, as if something unseen had risen through the soil and breathed rot into the roots. The sheriff walked the perimeter at sunrise. He counted 9 circles, each about the width of a child's outstretched arms. He didn't say a word, only pulled his coat tighter and walked back to town with his lantern still lit, though the sun was already up. That afternoon he returned to the chapel, alone. Inside, the linen bundles were gone again. The bells still lay cracked across the floor, but the room smelled different now. Not like death, like milk. Turned, warm, thick. The sheriff stood in the center of the nave, unmoving, and then he saw them. The hymn books, stacked again in the front pew, pages fluttering despite the still air. He reached for one, but stopped, because the air shifted. Not wind, not temperature. Presence. Something was behind him, close, breathing. He turned slowly. Nothing. Just the nave. Empty. But he felt it, the way a man feels when he stands on a grave that's too shallow. He stepped back, and then he saw it. Scrawled in the dust on the floorboards, "Not done." He did not wipe it away. He left the chapel without speaking, his face pale, eyes wide, not in fear, but in comprehension. This was not haunting. This was repetition, like a ritual, like a liturgy, like a rehearsal. Later that night, he gathered the town council, told them no one was to enter the chapel, not ever, not even to pray. God isn't what's listening in there, he said, and we're not the ones being saved. He looked each man in the eye. Whatever's inside, he said, wants to be remembered, wants to be finished. And then he said something none of them forgot. If the song completes, the door opens, and not just the one in the wood. The children began visiting homes again. Not as phantoms, as echoes. One mother woke to find tiny handprints across her frost-rimmed window on the inside. No tracks in the snow. No unlocked door. Another found her daughter's hymn book laid open on the dining table. But not to a song they had known. It was blank, except for a phrase etched into the grain of the wood beneath it. "We are listening." Ruth Penrose, now grey and sick with grief, heard tapping at her parlour door just past 3 in the morning. Not knocking. Rhythmic. Like a metronome. Like rehearsal. She opened it only an inch, and heard it. 9 voices. Faint. Whispering. But not to her. To each other. Reciting something together, over and over again. She slammed the door, pressed her back against it, and cried for the first time since the bell fell. The sheriff tried one last time to end it. He ordered the linen bundles removed, the robes burned, the bell shattered. But when his men returned to the chapel with axes and fire, they found the nave empty again. No bell, no bundles, no robes, only a circle of salt on the floor. And at its center, a single hymn book. The pages filled completely now, but not in ink, in needle marks. Every note, every lyric, every verse, stitched into the parchment in black thread. The sheriff reached down to lift it, but the moment his fingers touched the cover, he stopped, frozen, eyes wide, mouth open. Not in pain, in recognition. He whispered a single phrase before falling back onto the chapel floor, lantern spilling light across the salt ring. "They've named us now." And then the wind rose. Inside the sealed chapel. It circled the rafters, knocked over pews, extinguished the lantern. And as the dark swallowed the room whole, those watching from outside swore they heard a song rising, not sung by the children, but by men, Heathers, brothers, priests, a choir that had never existed, and yet somehow always had. And this is where you, the viewer, must choose. Are you listening, or are you being tuned? Comment below. They've named us now. They've named us now. Seal it. Bind it. Because once you say it,
You can't unknow it. By the final frost, Bellhurst was quiet again. But not the kind of quiet you pray for, the kind you fear, the kind that listens back. No more reports, no more sightings, no more footprints, only a stillness, thick as syrup, wrapped tight around the chapel like a second skin. But those who lived near, they knew, they felt it. Each night, the windows of the chapel pulsed with a faint glow, not flickering, not candlelight. It was steady, colorless, like the soft radiance of breath caught in linen. The sheriff, now a man changed in posture, in voice, in soul, was last seen walking the chapel path just before midnight. He did not carry his lantern. He did not wear his coat. Only the choir robe his son once wore, now altered, stitched with his own initials. Neighbors saw him enter. No one saw him leave. But the next morning, when Lydia Crane passed the chapel, out of habit, out of compulsion, she found the door slightly ajar. Not broken. Inviting. And inside, at the foot of the altar, lay a 10th bundle, wrapped in the same linen, stitched in the same thread, but marked with a badge of law folded beneath it, half burned, half frozen, rimmed in salt. She did not weep. She knelt, pressed her palm gently to the fabric, and whispered, "You've returned. Now you must rest." But the chapel did not fall still. From the rafters, a hum began. Not from the children, not from Ellery, from the walls themselves. As if the building remembered the music, and now sang it back, note by note. The town said nothing, not for weeks. But the feeling, the press of presence, the choir without form, it remained. One mother began setting a plate at the table for her daughter again. Another kept the cedar chest open so the robe could breathe. And some nights, not all, but some, a faint knocking could be heard beneath the floorboards. Like small hands keeping time, the town never rebuilt the chapel. They didn't tear it down either. They just left it. Because some doors are not meant to close, some songs are not meant to end. And some children once named, "Do not stay buried."